Wow, there's so many places to start, and I'm going to be a little bit selfish here, and I would like to start off and talk about the influence music obviously has in your work. If you dig a little bit and know the fuller body of work you have and your references, I just think it has to be a fascinating sort of touchstone for everything you've done. You've talked about Cage, you've talked online quite a bit about Tortoise, and I'm interested in the connection to Chicago there. But the first place I want to start is the connection to Factory from Confusion, because the immediate reference I get is how Factory did everything they did. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if all of you are familiar with Factory. It was really hugely influential record label in terms of not only the music, bands like New Order, but also its approach to graphic design and the idea that graphic design could really play a powerful role in the presentation of not only the music, but even the kind of ethos of particular bands and communicating the spirit of what drove the bands. So Peter Saville, really famous and well-respected British art director and graphic designer, is most known for his work producing quite radical record covers for Factory. Some of the record covers being so complex that they almost bankrupted the record label because they were so several releases they lost money because they put so much money into special die cuts and special inks on the labels, on the covers. And I think in general, in terms of the importance of music, in my work as a designer, I think music ultimately, even though I don't do that much work with music, I would really like to, and somehow I've just kind of fallen more into contemporary art and architecture and publishing rather than specifically records. But basically the reason I am a graphic designer today, I think it was a certain point in my childhood when I loved playing records and I would pore over the record covers and I spent a lot of my pocket money on 7 inches and 12 inch, first 7-inch singles and then 12 inches. This is how old I am. There was just one point in time, I forget when, it was pretty early, like maybe only the age of 9 or 10, where one day it just dawned on me that someone was getting paid to do this, like to design the covers. I thought, oh my God, like that's the idea that you could get paid to do something as fun and cool as making these beautiful record covers was kind of mind-blowing to me. And so that really, once I figured out that that was called graphic design, that was what I wanted to do.
How do you feel about the physical sort of demise of music and then the resurgence of vinyl?
Yeah, well, this is partly what the whole Confusion project, I took the opportunity to get in a lot of, as you probably caught from some of the things I was getting at in my talk there, a lot of that is sort of packed into a lot of my sort of contemporary cultural critique of design, dematerialization of music, documentation and promotion, and all of these different roles that design can play. A lot of that was packed into the Confusion project. And yeah, it's definitely mixed feelings. I mean, I'm really happy. I mean, partly selfishly, there was a certain point where I realized I was too late in terms of wanting to be a record cover designer because no one was really commissioning that so much anymore. But then at the same, and the idea that now, a lot of designers complained when artwork was reduced to compact disc sort of size, and now the fact that they're these tiny little JPEG thumbnails, and I still get annoyed when I pay for an album online and don't get a nice big high-res. I want high-res 300 meg TIFFs. I don't want just like a little, I want to still look at the artwork somehow. But yeah, at the same time, the resurgence of the value of, tactility and vinyl and people, crazy phenomena like record store day now and people queuing up to buy special releases, I find that still I find that heartening that people still like the physical object and find some value in the presentation of it's not all just about the music, because if it was just about the music, we'd all be happy streaming stuff on our phones with no artwork, which is, even for myself, the way I do experience a lot of music. I'll definitely admit that. But no, it gives me hope, and it's something I've, at least my poor daughters, I've kind of instilled in them. They know how to put records on, and they come records shopping with me, and they like the physical. Like for them, it's different. They like, when we're eating dinner, if they ask if they can get up and put a record on, and I don't know. I think the physicality of that is something that I also associate with books and with other objects. While at the same time, I'm a complete geek, and I code in HTML and CSS, and I love the web and technology and all of that. So, but for me, it's not, I guess in the same way that I was trying to get at with my talk of art versus design, it's not about any kind of false dichotomy, print versus digital or art versus design. It's kind of more just about what's good or what's bad or what's right at a particular point in time, whether it's, sometimes I want to listen to an album on my phone because I can my favorite band's got a new album, I can download it right there on the train. That's really cool, but I also, sometimes I want to listen to the same thing, you know, relaxed, putting a record on. So it's more about, I guess, simultaneity.
You said you haven't done a lot of work for artists in music, or I'm sorry, for musicians, but you did play a pretty critical role in what I would consider a pretty luminary music publication, The Wire. For me, that was the ray gun for me when I grew up. Carson got me excited, and then when I evolved a little bit and discovered The Wire, it was this perfect synthesis of music I was listening to and very smart design, started by non-format early in the 2000s, and then you took over late 2000s. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if all of you know about The Wire. The Wire's actually quite an old magazine. It's been around for over 25 years. It started out as purely as a jazz magazine, kind of focusing on improvised jazz. Gradually morphed into the magazine it is today, which is basically anything underground or avant-garde. I think, you know, the most commercial they've ever gotten is perhaps putting someone like Björk on the cover. And it was a big challenge for me getting I was extremely lucky to get The Wire because it was a magazine I read, and then I was basically contacted through a number of people that I knew and essentially handed the job, you know, non-format, who would quite well known for doing the work they did for The Wire. They did quite radical typographic treatments and using lots of floral elements or patterns and really bold type, pushed things along quite a lot. They wanted to leave, and I was just approached and basically said, do you want to do it or not? There wasn't any competition or anything. I just was handed it. And I was very busy running my own studio, doing a lot of work for galleries and museums and publishers. But I said yes because I'd always loved magazines and always wanted to work on one, and was just curious to see if I could actually handle it. That's usually what I usually say yes to anything, even whether I know if I can do it or not. And I highly recommend that approach, even though it's stressful. It usually works out. So The Wire, I kind of basically worked out with them. I would spend 1 week a month in the Wire office, and the rest of the time doing my own work. And even the other 3 weeks of the month, I was always fielding phone calls because The Wire was very small. So basically, I was the one who would also commission all the photographers. And even though I wasn't in the office for the given week, I would be getting phone calls saying, you know, we've got so-and-so on the cover next issue, and he's currently in New York, so you've got to sort that shoot out. And this person's in Berlin, this person's in Tokyo, and we need to have all the shoots sort of shot. I was very, like I am with a lot of things, and like I mentioned in my talk, I was very stubborn, so I didn't want to commission digital. I started it in 2005. I only wanted to commission medium format film, and so that, you know, given the tight turnarounds, it was kind of a really stupid idea to commission film. But especially when you're dealing with photographers in all parts of the world and having to rely on FedEx. But so I had this kind of crazy period of about 3 years of commissioning all the photographers, getting in there. I would typeset everything. It was just me and usually one assistant. I would read everything because that's always been another ethic of mine as a designer, that I have to read everything that I'm designing. Otherwise, I can't design it properly. I have to understand the content. And the guys at The Wire the first few months were saying, what are you doing? Like, where's this article and this article? Because they hadn't seen it yet. And I said, I'm still reading it. And I was like, what do you mean you're reading it? You got to just design it and get it out. And but I stuck with that. I would hand rag every single review, which was kind of just crazy because I would be up all night Sunday right before I went to the printers. But it was great. It was a really good experience and great environment to be in. Very conventional office, but you would, in any given day, you would have the advertising guys on the phone booking ads, and someone doing an interview over the phone with a musician, and you'd have some kind of extreme experimental finished noise piece at full volume blasting, kind of just going or something, and no one batting an eyelid, and they would just listen to the most avant-garde music, and that in itself was an education for me. And that, you know, like I mentioned, that was what I'm always looking for. Any graphic design job, I need to be educated. I want to come out of it having learned something. And so definitely with The Wire, I was hugely expanded my knowledge of music, which it was something I was already into, and I felt very lucky that I could read the issue before anyone else could, before it came out.
That's great. When you moved to Chicago to work for the MCA, it seems you wrote an article on the MCA blog about the Martin Krieg piece, and you referenced your history with Tortoise, and everyone from Soma and in between, who is more or less a Chicago native.
Mm.
What was that process like, coming here to the home of some music that I feel like played a pretty critical role in your development?
Yeah, no, it was a big deal for me to first be contacted by the museum about Chicago. And it wasn't a totally crazy idea to move here. We moved here from Arnhem in the Netherlands to Chicago, which is quite a culture shock to do that. But I had actually spent quite a bit of time in Chicago as a teenager. I can't even remember what the connection was, but we had very remote relatives who lived in Water Tower Place. And so one visit I think I must have only been 12 or 13, we visited their apartment, which looked right out onto John Hancock Center, which is still my favorite building in Chicago. And it kind of blew my mind, just this city in the Midwest with all these incredible skyscrapers. And later on, I grew up in a lot of different countries. That would be another whole lecture to get into where I lived, but I grew up in about 7 or 8 different countries. And friends of ours, at one point we lived in Sweden, and friends of ours were American. They were living in Stockholm because of their work with Caterpillar. Their son, Phil, was my age when I was about 15, 16. They moved back to Peoria, Illinois, which is the headquarters of Caterpillar. And so funnily enough, and people in Chicago are always really shocked when I say this, but I actually spent 2 summers in Peoria, Illinois as a teenager. And for me, I loved it. It was the most exotic thing ever. Just the kind of the flatness of the drive from Chicago to St. Louis. I still love. I have a client. I work with the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis now and go down there quite a bit. And people are always like, "Oh God, that drive," and I'm like, "No, I love it." These huge, tall gas station signs and the flatness and the license plates from all over. Like, I still love this. This kind of seeming banality, which I still find really exotic. And so basically, but we did, at a certain point, Peoria did get admittedly a little bit boring. So we used to drive up to Chicago and stay with my friends' grandparents in Oswego, and we would come into Chicago. So that period was really formative for me. I discovered a lot of independent labels and bought music of Chicago musicians, and found zines and different things like that. And so that kind of always stuck with me. So, now moving here to work at a Contemporary Art Museum, that has always had a close association with music. And the whole point that I was making today of sort of hybridity of artistic practice, the idea that graphic designers can be publishers or musicians or artists, for me that's really the story of Chicago history. You have all these different figures who were always, incredible figures like Art Paul, who was the radical pioneering art director of Playboy back in the 60s, when it was actually, the design-wise, it was extremely forward-thinking in its design and very radical compared to other commercial magazines. And he would commission illustrators who happened to be famous painters, or subsequently famous painters like Ed Paschke and people like that. So Chicago's always had this kind of hybridity of, chances are the musician you're into also does the artwork for the record label and publishes zines, and I don't know, there's always been that kind of spirit, which for me marks Chicago art as being quite unique and something I love.
You said Rick hired you as an outsider to write the statement for his show. Do you feel like an outsider?
Sort of. Partly, I had this weird transition to Chicago where, right now I'm really very happy to almost be rediscovering Chicago, because we moved here in 2010. There was a huge, huge amount of work to be done at the museum. So I basically spent my whole time in the museum working. I've got my 2 daughters and my wife, and any spare time I would want to spend with them. And so on a certain level, I wasn't really going, I don't really go out much in Chicago. So I've been very fortunate to get to know certain designers and artists in Chicago. But I don't get around very much. So on a certain level, I still feel like an outsider. And it's only now that I left the museum about a year ago and decided to keep living here and to start my practice again, that I've been able to rediscover the city and go out and, certain people that I've been aware of, I've been able to get in touch with them and started working with them on certain projects. And I still feel like in a way I don't know, it's both outsider, but also the fact that, again, something I feel like is unique for a city of this scale, that Chicago is genuinely welcoming and friendly. Like, there isn't really so much, I wouldn't ever say that there's really competition between designers, in my opinion. There's much more collaboration that goes on, and a kind of collectivity. Everyone feels like, well, if you're living in Chicago and you've been through an insane winter like the one that we've just had, you kind of you know, you're deliberately choosing to be here. Like you're not just leaving this as soon as it gets cold. So I feel like that builds this real sense of camaraderie. So on a certain level, I do feel very much part of Chicago. Like I definitely would consider myself as a Chicago designer now. But at the same time, I still talk a bit funny and don't have a local accent. And I, you know, I still work in London. I have clients there, and we now live out in the suburbs. My wife and I are getting into gardening. I'm leading pretty quiet life. So just on a local level, I still feel like a bit of an outsider. I'm not going out drinking with designers all the time. So there are multiple levels of outsiderness, and probably the more kind of everyday boring level of outsiderness is what it is now, rather than any kind of avant-garde notion of outsiderism.
Well, I love the Dip in the Lake poster you're going to have at the show, because to me, there's something about that blends your outsider status with the way you work, which to me feels very Chicago. So on one hand, you're paying homage to some seminal figures who played a huge role in putting Chicago on the map from a design standpoint. But on the other hand, just the execution, the scrappiness of it, relates to me as a Chicago designer. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's really easy to fall into stereotypes when you're talking about Chicago, but I think there's always truth to stereotypes. And one thing I do love about Chicago, which you know, it's people call it the city that works, or there's always this kind of down-to-earth pragmatism to Chicago, or grittiness, which you can start to roll your eyes over when you hear it too much. But at the same time, that's something I really love, the kind of lack of pretension in Chicago and the honesty of just getting things done and making things happen and having a raw element to it. Things don't have to be too perfect. You can just get it done. It's better to just get it done and get it out there. And almost this kind of punk attitude that I've always tried to hold on to since I was a teenager, this idea of just do it yourself. If you don't know how to do it, just say you know how to do it and then learn from it and make some mistakes and experiment and get it out there. And so that's kind of, I mean, a good example of this poster where I just thought, well, I'm going to, in a way, I've been asked to design a poster for the IGA, and I'm not really going to design a poster. Or for me, in a way, the act of design is the collage. Like, just I'm going to take that element and just push them together. And with that very seemingly throwaway act, it can be, in my opinion, it can be quite profound to just very subtly layer these things, put it out there, and people will stop and say, oh, I know that poster, and then wait a minute, I know that building, and then, well, I know that work, and that's ultimately what I'm trying to do. Just like I mentioned in the beginning, I think just make things simple, and I'm always trying to strip things back. I'm always very self-aware and self-critical as a designer. If there's any superfluous element, I'm questioning myself. Can I strip it back further? Is there a way of doing it already? It's almost a kind of level of humility sometimes. If someone else has done something better, I'll just use their thing rather than my thing, and you can call it a fine line, whether it's a rip-off or a homage. And I don't know, these are things that really interest me. And they're notions that come up a lot in art, and I feel like graphic design, they're really interesting questions to explore as well.
I want to make sure we open up to your guys' questions. If there's a microphone towards the back, if anyone has a question they'd like to ask James, you guys can go line up back there, and we can get to that. And while you guys are moving over there, one last question I have for you. Not necessarily a question, but I love the Dear Lulu, Dear Blurb, that whole project, which to me, when you talked about the color picture, stripping that of its functionality, this seems to be the reverse project, where you're making something exquisitely beautiful that has a function that didn't exist. And I think a lot of people are scared to use digital publishing on demand because they don't know how their work's going to turn out.
Exactly.
I mean, could you just talk a little bit about the inspiration behind that project?
Yeah. Do you all know this project, Dear Lulu? It came out of this very question that David just asked. I mean, I discovered Lulu, lulu.com, in case some of you don't know. It's print-on-demand, online print-on-demand service. You can upload a PDF, you can buy a copy for yourself and have it sent to you, or you can make it available to others. So it's really, for me, very radical, another one of those points in time, very radical notion where you can have instant distribution and print one copy of something or print 100 copies and make it available instantly to anyone all over the world. So it blew me away. I first discovered it teaching at RISD. I still teach at RISD regularly. I visit there. I'm a visiting thesis critic there. I first visited in 2006, I think. And a lot of the students had these really polished looking, perfect bound, glossy booklets. And I started asking them, where are you guys printing all these really expensive looking booklets, and they kept saying, "Oh, Lulu." I did it with Lulu, and I was like, "Who's this Lulu? Like everyone keeps talking about Lulu." And so that turned out it was Lulu.com, this print-on-demand service. And yeah, as you asked, and this was, I think, the question that would pop into any designer's mind, all right, so if I'm going to send off some artwork and I have to pay for it already and get it printed, does it have to be RGB? Does it have to be CMYK? Do I need to set bleed or add crop marks? What kind of binding is it? I had all these questions, and I thought it would be great to do some kind of test booklet. And as you saw from the beginning of the very first slide of mine, I have one of my many obsessions is test patterns, and the way that, for me, it's another whole field of graphic design, which is non-graphic design. It's sort of designed by engineers, the idea of test patterns for screen or for photocopiers or for printers, the beautiful marks and blocks of color and lines that you get almost by accident, that for me are objects of beauty, but also have empirical production value of just telling you whether something is in alignment or whether it's printing correctly. And I thought it'd be great to do that kind of book for Lulu. Like someone should do that, because that would be, then I could buy one and see how it works and see if I need to adjust my colors. And a few months later, I was asked to give a workshop in Germany. By this point, it was 2008. And I was really struggling for ideas. I often come up with ideas for workshops at the very last minute. And it was really only, I think, 48 hours before I was due to fly to Germany. I still hadn't really thought of an idea. What am I going to get the students to do? And then I thought, oh, I know. I've been thinking for months about how can I find time to make this print-on-demand test book. The perfect answer is I don't have to do it. I'll get the students to do it, and they'll make it for me. And so that's what we did. It really came out of, I didn't know it was going to be called Dear Lulu. I just went to Germany. Color in German is Farben. So I said, well, let's do a project called Farben on Demand. We're going to do a test book for print on demand, and let's look at, everyone has to bring as many tests and kind of test patterns and documents and print tests that they can possibly find. That was the first morning. And we only had 2 days, and so we somehow managed to do this 100-page book with all these different color tests, line tests. We photographed skin. We lined up all of the students of the whole college to do a kind of human rainbow, and did all these experiments, and somehow within 2 days packaged this book, and it's still available online. If anyone wants to find out how Lulu works, you can order this book.
How many publishing places did you do? You did Lulu, Blurb.
We did Lulu. At the time, there was a German print on demand called BOD, Books on Demand. So we first did Dear Lulu and Dear Blurb. And an important part of the design process for us was giving it a Creative Commons license. So we thought this is a perfect thing. We were very transparent. We didn't want to make any profit on it. So for us, another part of the design decision and part of something that was informative was not only receiving the book with these different color tests, but was also understanding how much to say an A5 or like half letter 100-page book in full color cost. So we just priced it at the unit cost with no profit. And we also made the PDF available for free. So we thought if people want to download it and then run it through another process, they should totally do that and then tell us what happened. And so a few people did that. And as more print-on-demand companies came online, some of them would actually ask me. A Norwegian print-on-demand publisher contacted me and asked me to make one for them. And as more, Blurb came up, so I made a Blurb one, and MagCloud came out, so I made a MagCloud one. And the actual title came out of one of the students' just very honest questions, that we were all thinking aloud as we were working on all our different experiments. And one student asked a great question. I wonder if anyone reads these things. Like, where do these things get printed? Is there some engineer that is watching them being printed? So this is where the whole Dear Lulu title came from. We thought, let's write a letter on the cover that kind of politely asks the printer to make it for us. And we didn't think in terms of extendability or scalability, but it happened to be perfect that we could just change the name. So it was Dear Lulu or Dear Blurb or Dear MagCloud. And it kind of just had a life of its own after that.
So we have a question?
Yeah, hi. Oh, that's loud. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions. I remember you talking about being at college and being pretty adamant about not kind of marketing yourself or like sending your work out to contests or publications. But then later on in your life, after you graduated, you were like approached by all these wonderful universities and different clients. And did you find that people just kind of found you, or like what happened there?
Yeah, well, I was kind of very naive and very stubborn, like I've mentioned, but at the time, I still kind of hold on to these things, so I'm still stubborn. I haven't really learned anything on one level, but it kind of meant that things happened really slowly for me. I definitely wrote letters and sent work to people I was interested in. So if there was a publisher I liked or a gallery I liked, I would send them work, or I would even call them up. And often I knew that they already had a designer that they work with, and I wasn't trying to steal their work, but I was just genuinely interested to meet people and talk and start to understand how the various industries that I was interested in working within, how they worked. And so I was lucky. I got a few bits of freelance work designing book covers for a publishing company, and that kind of at least helped me feed myself while I was looking for work. But a lot of it just happened really slowly. I would go and see certain publishers, and they already had designers, and I would not hear anything for a couple of years. But then it would turn out that the director of the publishing company had liked talking with me, and later on when someone else contacted me out of the blue, and I would really wonder, like, how did they hear about me? And then they would say, well, so-and-so told me about you. And so in London, I just very slowly kind of built this word of mouth network and started to do work, and people would see it. And for me, the idea was not to be seen so much in magazines, but I was really happy if someone saw my book in a bookshop and read it or looked at it and liked it and took the time to find out who designed it, and then took the time to ask the publisher who it was, or to Google me or whatever. And so it was just a very slow, very stubborn way of building a studio, and kind of, I don't know, just for me it was more real. Even today, I much more value if someone leaves a comment on Amazon about the book design. That means a huge amount to me, much more than getting a design award.
Okay, thanks. And then something else that kind of caught my attention when you were talking about the Confusion exhibition, and you said that you were approached to kind of make an identity for them, but they didn't have any work yet, basically. So how do you kind of deal with clients or have you ever dealt with a client who didn't really know what they wanted, but kind of just said, make this for us? Like, how do you deal with that?
I get that a lot, but I always choose to see it as an opportunity. And it's something, for me, it's the perfect opportunity to build the kind of relationship that I always strive for with clients, which is one of respectful equals, and one of being equal collaborators. So, and ultimately, this is where my sort of theory of practice as a verb rather than as a noun, the idea of not being perfect or professional, but just learning, has really informed my whole spirit of working with people, where over the years, working with very small galleries who sometimes perhaps wouldn't have an editor for the book, and rather than complaining about the writing or complaining that there's no one doing that job that I'm not getting paid for, I would just ultimately feel like, well, I'm not getting paid for this, it's going to take me a whole lot more time, but I'm going to step in and be the editor for this project as well, because someone needs to keep things together. And luckily I'm very fussy with spelling, and I like reading, so I try to write. So I always felt like, well, I can offer this as well as part of my design practice. And if people appreciate it and we get a much better project out of it, they benefit from it and I benefit from it in terms of learning how to publish things and learning how to edit books, which for me is just as valuable. I mean, you may as well as a designer learn about that side of it, given that we, by default learn about how to print things and how to distribute things. Ultimately that's led to me being able to work on the publishing side at the museum and work with, negotiating co-publishing deals and getting certain books published. And now my wife and I, just in the next few months, we're starting up our own children's book publishing company.
I think we're just about out of time, but one last question I would have for you. And
hold on, David, I got a question.
Oh, you do? All right. Go for it.
How's it going?
Hey, good, thanks.
Well, you said a lot of interesting things earlier. One of them that is art and design. They're both design, and I really like that. And you also said that designers can have their own exhibits, graphic designers, which is something very fascinating. From the slides that you showed and some of your work, one thing that I realized that you keep integrity of all of your designs. And even though that you mentioned that there's an advertising culture right now, that it's not easy for you to have something out there that is not related to a product. How do you keep that integrity of design, even though that for example, I'm a freelancer right now. Most of the jobs that I get is for a product, or I'm trying to promote something. And I run into problems with most of my clients that they want me to do something that I think is unethical design-wise. How do you deal with that? Because I see that in most of your work, that some clients might oppose what you have, but it seems like you close them in a very good way.
Yeah, well, often, I mean, I think a huge unsung part of graphic design is just the talking and the dialogue, and I often refer to it as diplomacy, where I build really good relationships with my clients because sometimes, I mean, this is all the kind of thing that you don't see in the final pieces, but there's often a lot of negotiation. There are constraints. Another thing that I love that Charles Eames said, for example, is making the distinction between compromise and constraint. And something that I've always learned from and kind of held to, the idea that I really embrace constraints, and so I'm willing to be told you can't do that. And so then I think, okay, well, if you're telling me I can't do that, that means I can do this. And you often surprise the client where they say, well, I didn't quite mean that. But then they can't really argue against it because they said that, you know. So Charles Eames, you know, really said something really good about, you know, he doesn't accept compromise, but he willingly accepts constraints. And so that's something that I always strive for. And I feel like, I mean, this kind of in a way points to something that I love about Chicago, where for me there's, even compared to London, where you usually have designers who are solely in, you know, they only do stuff for culture, which is kind of where I'm coming from, or they only do stuff in the kind of more commercial corporate spheres. And what I love about Chicago is that there's much less distinction. And, you know, showing Container Corporation work by John Massey, for example, is a perfect example, because Container Corporation for me is fascinating. It was, you know, major, huge commercial operation, basically selling boxes, you know, selling packaging. But they, in the 60s, 50s and 60s, they commissioned Walter Gropius, or, you know, really avant-garde artists and designers to do advertisements that were not even selling anything necessarily. I mean, ultimately they were selling a whole ethos. You know, you wanted to associate with Container Corporation because they were radical and forward-thinking. But I always feel like there's something that I've learned a lot from just being in Chicago is not to be afraid of commercial commissions or the capacity to even get something out of it. Obviously, you have much more, I don't know, on some level I find even more constraints within the art world sometimes than a commercial project. But I feel like there's always a way of, you know, even though things might go against your own personal ethos design-wise, I think there are always ways to benefit ultimately from the dialogue you can have and to learn from what the client says and to understand the realities of the networks that are particular, even an advertisement, the networks that operates within, and to see what you can do to gently subvert things or to push things forward a little bit.
Got it. Thank you.
So the last question I would have for you is, you wrote at one point about a time when you were considering whether or not you would be an artist or a designer. And I think in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense where you netted out where you are today. But I'm assuming your philosophical approach and stance on the profession and what that means was percolating early on. What was the switch that took you to where you are, or made you follow this path?
Well, this came up a lot when I was studying at the Royal College of Art. I was really much more into contemporary art and curatorial practice even. There's a really strong curatorial program at the Royal College of Art, which is basically art students learning to become curators and to organize exhibitions, and I was really fascinated by that. So I actually hung out a lot in that department and skipped a lot of the graphic design lectures, which I wish I hadn't now, because obviously, as you can see now, I'm basically always catching up. I'm forever trying to read history and learn history because I value it hugely. But at the time, I was kind of like, graphic design, I think contemporary art is much more interesting. I want to do that. And so I was making a lot of more art kind of pieces, like postal art pieces, where I would put things in the post and see what happens and send them to someone I didn't know and see what happened when it came back. But at the same time, I'd always have an impulse to document it, and I would make a really nice book. And I would love typesetting the book and designing the book. And there was always something, you know, and I love type design. There was always something naturally pulling me back to graphic design. And ultimately what I realized was graphic design, I didn't have to necessarily make a choice between being an artist or being a graphic designer, and one thing meaning I was allowed to do a certain type of work, and being a graphic designer meaning I wasn't allowed to do a certain type of work. It was much more realizing that graphic design is this perfect discipline where you encounter lots of other interesting people all the time. And so I'm meeting a lot more artists and curators than I probably would have done as an artist, because I'm in the role of a designer working with these types of people. And I love architecture, and I'm really interested in architectural history, so I get to work with architects and with writers because I work with publishers, all the people that I admire, and kind of feel like, ultimately as an artist, I feel like I probably wasn't going to be a good enough artist, so I'll just be a designer. But it's been kind of liberating the last 10 years or so to realize that, well, as a designer, if I have an idea for a project, I don't have to wait to be given permission to do it. If it's, if it has its own merits and can stand up against any other type of work, why not go ahead and do it and see if there's a forum for that? And ultimately, for me, the idea of putting something in a gallery so much is not really aspiring to be like an artist, but often putting something in a gallery is a really design-led, pragmatic decision of what kind of environment is built to display work with lighting and white walls, and built as a way that's accessible, that anyone can come in and look at it. And often that means a gallery rather than making a book.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that can often be as strong a design decision to put something in a gallery as it can be to make a book or make a poster.
Thank you, James. Thank you for coming to DePaul, and thank you for talking tonight. And it's fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.